did what I was asked to do, take your laptop.
You did. So there you go.
There it is, okay, and not in front of me. Okay.
Are we good then, Dave? Okay, then I'm off.
Okay, yes. All right, here we go.
Well, good morning to you Zoomers and to all of you here in our sanctuary for the morning. I'll start over. Is that better? Thank you for the help. So to our Zoomers and to all of you who are here in the sanctuary this morning, we welcome to our season's grand finale until fall. Our Mosaic theme has been intended to reflect the composite of beautiful designs put together with separate, varied components. Throughout this curricular year, we have hosted a mosaic of varied topics and presenters, including praying poets, spirituality in the arts of dance, music, visual art, the migration process, early pietism, and more. These separate yet related visions have been reconstructed into new learnings for us. This morning, we look forward to a different facet related to the introduction presented last Sunday by Dennis Voskuil on early pietism, tag-teamed with Dennis by another of our own members, Nella Kennedy. Along with Dennis and Don Brugink, Nella is a senior fellow at the Van Raalte Institute working on new history, this one to be of Dimnat Chapel. One of the 7 wonders in the ancient world, the Colossus of Rhodes, has been said to have spanned the entrance to the harbor of Rhodes. Well, our Nella spans a great deal of our own world of art. Not only has she been a history professor and art scholar, she's a professional art historian. She writes and directs plays for adults and children that we have enjoyed. Her creative wit is rich and productive, and she spans the Atlantic Ocean with part of her family in the Netherlands and the entire globe with another son in Japan. So we are about to have one of the delightful pleasures of sharing her study of, and yes, I had to learn to pronounce Geesche van der Haar, who has family ties with Third Church and is one of Holland's earliest settlers who kept a voluminous diary that forms the basis of our visit today. Please welcome a Colossus of Third Church.
She could have compared me with the pyramids, too. Okay, Geesche van der Haar, or in the Netherlands she would be Geesche van der Haar Visser, but here with the Americans they do it the other way. I called it an autobiography and a diary because she began to write when she was on board the ship in 1869. She had visited the Netherlands with her husband after about 30 years in the US. And it was a boring time, apparently, no entertainment on the ship. So she began to write her memoirs. When she came home, she continued it, but then it became a diary. The theme last week, as Peg said, was pietism. So what I want to do then is to see how the life of Geesche reflected the various sort of elements of pietism in her life. But I also want to talk a little bit about her life to create a context for her diary. I hope my mouse will work. It does not. I'll try this. Okay. All right, you can see by this portrait taken when she was probably in her 50s that she might not have been a barrel of fun. just looking at her visage. But you know, in those days, you're not supposed to smile in the camera. She was born in 1820 and died in 1901. The next image is her husband, who has a more pleasant visage than she does. He was known apparently for his twinkling eyes, and that certainly comes through here. He was born in 1817 and died in 1895. The couple had been shopkeepers in Genemuiden, which is in the province of Overijssel. According to some of the records, he also was a dairyman, and that shows up when he came to the United States, although he kept both professions. They left just a few months after Van Raalte did in 1846, and they knew Van Raalte quite well, so they chose to go where he went. They traveled to Baltimore. In contrast to Dominee Van Raalte, who landed in New York, they landed in Baltimore, then went to Pittsburgh, down the Ohio River to St. Louis, and ultimately via Chicago to Holland, Michigan, arriving there when there were already a few settlers located. It was still very primitive. They had to stay in a Native American village, and that was actually a good thing. People were very kind to them, and they learned there the art of cutting down a tree, to how to manipulate an axe, how to create a log cabin. Their early log cabin was very small. It had 2 rooms. The size was about 16 by 20 feet. But even in those early days, with this stream of immigrants coming to West Michigan, they would at times have 3 families, even in this very small cabin. They always had been very hospitable, so it was probably not unusual. Which one do I use now? Both. Okay, great. You can hear me still pretty well? Okay, good. I want to show you now the first house that they had bought, and this was a store. It was also a school in the front room. It was on 40 acres, and Jan had bought this at the advice of Reverend Van Raalte, who said, you know, you should buy this property on sort of west of Holland, and it was located on the corner of 16th and Waverly. Now, for any of you knowing Holland, you know what is there now? Myers, the Myers store. So here was the shopkeeper of grocery stores, which now we have Meijer, basically a grocery store too. The value probably has vastly increased since that time. Jan was a very enterprising man. He was not the kind of bookish person, the introspective person that his wife was, but he was an entrepreneur, and he immediately saw what needed to be done. He bought a pair of horses. They were somewhat well off or comfortable in the Netherlands, so he had some means when he came here. Bought a pair of horses and also a wagon, and he began to transport goods from Grand Haven and Grand Rapids that were so badly needed in Holland, because they had just arrived, so they hadn't farmed yet. There was nothing there. It had to be imported, and that's what he did. Also, passengers could go with him on roads that were not particularly fantastic in those early days. They prospered pretty well. There were times when there was a drought or there was some financial crisis in the US, but on the whole, they did very well. So they kept sort of moving and changing. Also, business ventures. For a time, he had bought some land near the harbor, a wooded land, and he, with some people whom he hired, strip the bark of trees, and apparently the bark could be used for leather making. I don't know what happened to that, but apparently that did okay. He also bought some land on which he could raise pigs, and had a little pork producing plant on the side. So it was interesting to see how they prospered in Holland. This is a photograph taken at their 50th wedding anniversary. It was very interesting to hear to read the accounts, because there was a long article about them in the Holland Sentinel, even in the Christian Intelligencer, about this couple and the good they had done. At the celebration, ministers would come, professors of Hope College, because this was in 1891, so Hope was well on its way to be a good institution. So they were a very well respected couple. At that time, but just before that, there had been a controversy, as many of you know already, in Pillar Church. They attended that, of course. They loved Van Raalte, they knew him very well. And, but the church was getting too full, so Van Raalte and maybe the consistory had decided that the church needed to be split, so they began, or a group of people began Ebenezer Church on the south side of Holland. I think it still exists today. And then sort of arbitrarily, Van Raalte decided to split Holland in two. So west of Market Street, which is now Central Avenue, became the place where the new church was to be found. So anywhere on the east side of that could stay at Pillar. Well, the Vissers lived on the west side, and then they had to move to the new church. And Geesje was not particularly happy about this. And she often went back to Pillar, especially because she didn't like Reverend Utterwick, whom Elton likes very much in his book, but says she did not all the time. So her children liked to go to Third. So there were times when she and Jan would go to Pillar, but the children went to Third Reformed. It became a little bit better with the Masonic controversy at Pillar when the church split over that issue, and people, some of the members decided to be Reformed rather than Christian Reformed ultimately. So she was happier at Third, was a faithful member, especially faithful to the Women's Missionary Union. She had a daughter who had married a minister. They had gone to Africa, to South Africa as missionaries, and she liked the mission cause. She very faithfully attended them. She recorded that in her diary. She would say bad attendance, bad collection this time. They were pretty generous in what they did with their money as well. This is a picture of their children, probably taken about 1866, shortly after their son Willem. And you can just read the names and the dates of the various children. Willem had served in the Civil War. Then he went or finished at Hope College and went to seminary. At that time, I don't think there was a seminary here, but I'm not sure about the dates. Dennis would know. And then went out east, where he died of smallpox. It was a great grief to Geesje, especially. There was a special bond with him, also a sort of a spiritual bond, a meeting of minds. And throughout her diary, you see this reflection of sorrow, of grief that remained her whole life, and looking forward in death when she would meet him in heaven. One of the sons, Arend, was quite a prominent citizen in Holland, was a lawyer, he had also wanted to go into the Civil War when he was 16, which was not legal because he didn't have permission of his parents. So Geesje marched to the registration office and took him home. So instead of that, he went into law training. So a little bit about the family here on the slides. Now, a pietism in the Netherlands, what was that like? Was it different from other areas? It was very much influenced by various forces from abroad, especially England and Germany. But what was it like before in the 17th century? This is the formation, basically, of the Reformed Church. The Spanish were not as much a threat anymore. The United Provinces were had more peace than they had before. At the Synod of Dort, we have the three standards of unity developed, the Canons of Dort, the Heidelberg Catechism, and the Belgic Confession, which it is said was a faithful witness to the Word of God. And that was set in place. Well, a century or so later, or sooner even, a movement involved in a kind of a reaction to perhaps the cerebral quality of the theologians of especially the 17th century. It is called, the movement is called the Further Reformation, so or an after Reformation. And there was a desire to add something that was missing in the early years. And what was needed was, and I have this here, there's the standards of unity. I shouldn't have bypassed that so lightly. A more emphasis on godliness, on personal piety, an awareness of one's unworthiness, and this could really take on a kind of an unsavory quality sometimes. Concern for others, so doing good. They were strict Sabbatarians, and especially what was important was a call to conversion, so that you could say that you had been converted. It was not enough to be a church member. So how could you do that? By reading the Bible, sort of personal. This was not the church, this was the personhood. So you yourself read the Bible, read edifying material, and there was lots of that, because in the Netherlands there were many publications or publishing firms. To have an intense prayer life, and also contacts with fellow believers. If you just go to church and you leave, you pass the peppermints to each other, then you go home. And this led then to the founding of conventicles, as they were called. Basically a fancy word for meeting together with fellow Christians. So there's a greater intimacy, something that you would not have in church. Now, initially, these were to complement the church service, so complement the sermon, and maybe embroidering on the sermon, discussing it, and pastors were generally in charge, but would be a way in which the people who attended to converse with one another, to go over material they may have read and had thought about. Well, what happened ultimately in time is also, we're now in the 18th century, is the age of the Enlightenment, and many people began to be unhappy with their own pastors who disregarded or minimized the authority of Scripture, who emphasized Christ's love rather than his death for our sin. So the conventicles began to replace, in a way, the church service. It became much more important to them, the meetings and what they had read and what they could discuss, than what would happen in the church, which was not satisfying. So what happened then in those groups in the 18th century? And this was very much Geesje's experience also when she grew up in the 19th century. It was the testimony of conversion. You had to show that something happened in your life, some event that was crucial, that changed your life completely. In the conventicles, they also would talk about their moments of joy, of spiritual delight, so it wasn't always gloom. They would also talk, I mentioned something about the unworthiness, how they were tempted, even though they had been converted, how they were still tempted by Satan to have moments of doubts, especially. That was a sort of a big thing. It was not to repent of sin, you know, some murdering your neighbor or something. It was more like, you know, the doubt was sown into your heart by Satan. There was a lot of singing also and praying. The singing was generally in the Netherlands the Psalms. And it's astounding, really, to see how much Geesje remembered. You know, even from the early years before she had her conversion experience, she was a singing woman. And she, in the home too, people sang a lot and would remember the Psalms. Geesje was born in Genemuiden, and I don't know if I had a... Oh, I'm sorry, I wanted to mention about the reading of that the people did. I talked about the literature that people needed to read in the pietistic movement. One of them is Brakel, and this was a work that was based on Revelation, also a little bit of the Heidelberg Catechism, but it was again for the edification of basically the lay person. What is really amazing, if you go to the Holland Museum or the archives, you will see many of these really hefty volumes that the early pioneers took with them to this country. You know, this was in Pella as well, or other areas where Dutch people went. They wouldn't have very much space, you know, just a little sort of wooden crate in which they took the essentials, but they took sometimes really large Bibles, but also these books for your edification. And Brakel, you know, you cannot get rid of a Brakel because everyone, you know, every museum has enough. You know, no more Brakels, no more Schortinghuis, no more of these other divines. I mentioned to you about the conventicles, that they initially led by pastors, and that continued anyway, but increasingly we have the oefenaars, and those are non-ministerial laity who could be devout people and really know the scripture, but they also could have some very kooky ideas. And they were looked down upon, especially by the ministers. Genemuiden, I just wrote this down so in case you want to know how that is spelled. She was born there, so was her husband, her future husband. She married there. There are not many records there of the time she was, because there was a fire, destroyed all the church records. But in the neighboring village of Mostenbroek, and ultimately Van Raalte became the pastor of a seceded church in both these communities. They were very close together. So what did Reformed pastors think of these conventicles, these groups that would meet? And Geesje's family, her grandmother, for example, some of her uncles, would have conventicles in their houses, and Geesje would attend those. But pastors thought they were really terrible and subversive groups. One of the pastors of Mostenbroek said in a consistory meeting in 1826, or there was a question that came up, what can we do to stop this fanaticism? He said that those people scorn the rational search of the scriptures and spoke with the same scorn about the uneducated who led the conventicles. He also had to face the great opposition in many of the Reformed churches, including Genemuiden and Mostenbroek, about the hymn book. This came out actually in 1805 or 1806 already, but the synod, or the general synod of the Reformed Church, said that every church needed to sing one hymn out of this book. So it's a psalm book, and it had hymns as well. And many of these hymns were sort of enlightenment-laden songs, or not at all like the Psalms. They felt Psalms were biblical, and the Holy Spirit had allowed them to be written down. Hymns were human-made, so you don't sing those in church. Maybe at home, but not in church. So here we have an example for the hymn that they might have opposed to. City folk love the Lord, hope for prosperity once again, through the merchants' busy trade, sales for the shopkeeper, artisans' employment, bread for the poor. May God give us peace and command his blessings. So I just took one example, but there are several others as well. So people really, opposed this quite strenuously. One of her uncles, a Van der Haar uncle, was actually dismissed from the consistory because of his violent outrage by this as well. Geesje's background was not that she came from a home that was ungodly, but it was probably not converted. They didn't have this experience. They were godly people. That's in the home she learned how to sing the Psalms. Her grandfather was in the consistory in Genemuiden, and her own grandmother's house was the place for the conventicles. And that's where Geesje often would go, and she stayed with her grandmother. At home, at the home of her grandmother, it was actually her own home, she heard an uncle speak about his conversion history. And she fled in kind of an anxiety to another room where she fell on her knees and prayed to God to be merciful to her and convert her. So after this time, her spirits were in a great turmoil. She felt very unworthy. She said herself, and she wrote this all in this history, that she did not dare to pray. She knew from scriptures the prayers of the wicked are an abomination to the Lord. She felt that she could only live a life of self-condemnation. Second Christmas Day, which is celebrated in the Netherlands, she was 14. Then she again went to her grandmother's house. There were several godly people there. She often used the word pious, but in our life, pious doesn't have always a very positive connotation. But godly would, I think, be a better translation. One was an old man from another town, because they would come from everywhere to these conventicles. And he said to her, "Did you come because you want to serve Jesus?" She wanted to say yes, but as she wrote, it was a struggle with her corrupt nature, with the world and Satan. And all that winter long, so after Christmas, she felt quite miserable. She knew many Bible verses about unrighteousness and judgment. She read her Bible also a great deal, but the way of release remained dark. Very interesting word that was used by the pietists, dark, which was the unregenerated spirit, and then light, to see the light again. So how could she, as a sinner, pray to a righteous God? She actually told nobody about her struggle. And then on March 11, so a few months later, turned it too soon. She was at a conventicle at someone's house. She didn't say who. There were many people there. There was a lot of praying and singing and speaking, and she did not. She still felt uncomfortable. Then they began to sing the 6th verse of Psalm 86. I'm sure that's familiar to all of you. It wasn't to me, I had to look it up. And then she joined in, and it said, "Teach me," that's basically a portion of the hymn, "Teach me your will, incline my heart to fear your name. I will praise you and lift my whole heart to you." And it seemed to her that an audible voice was speaking in her ear, saying, "Be not unbelieving, but believe." And then I joined with my whole heart. And that was her conversion experience. This was in 1834. This was about the same time that there were problems in the Reformed Church with a number of pastors who reacted to the liberalism in the Reformed Church. It was pretty pervasive, especially when it dealt with very important people, also with the General Synod powers that were, so not everyone was bad, but it was a bad situation. And these pastors basically said, and Van Raalte was one of them, that we want to go back to what it was like in the early days of the Reformation. You know, look at the articles of faith, you know, the canons of Dort. You know, we have trespassed all the things that we should have kept on. Their protest was so that they were dismissed from the ministry. They could not stay anymore. So ultimately, they began, since they were still pastors, not recognized. You know, if you look at documents, it will say Mr. Van Raalte or Mr. Brammelkamp. So the authorities did not want to recognize. They were no longer ministers. They were dismissed. So they began to preach in houses and in barns, and ultimately, well, I suppose they were called seceders. A better word actually is the Dutch afscheiding, is a separation from, which is, I think, somewhat expressive than secession would be, of 1834. One of those pastors, probably the one who began it, Dominee de Kok from Groningen, came to preach in Mostenbroek and did this about 4 times, and one of her brothers was converted under his ministry. Those people those seceded ministers would travel all over the Netherlands. Some of the names you might know, well, I mentioned de Kok, we have Brommelkamp, we have Scholte, Van Velzen, and these people, you know, had a hard time, you know, with traveling on pretty poor roads. It's interesting what Geesje wrote about the Koks coming to speak in her church. We had not heard anything like that for a long time. So in a sense, you know, she was saying her church, Genemuiden, you know, the gospel basically was not preached. So the people left and they formed a kind of a denomination, and many of the people in Mostenbroek and Genemuiden left the church to be part of this seceded group. This was not an easy thing, because according to the Napoleonic law of several decades earlier, you could not meet for any kind of meeting, but you could not meet if you did not have permission to meet with more than 20 people. Well, especially in that region, the leaving the church was massive. So it was very hard to go to a house or a barn and not have more than 20 people. The result of that was that the people, the leaders, would be fined if you owned the barn or the house in which this meeting was held. You could be fined substantial amounts. This happened also to many of the relatives of Geesje herself. There were just a lot of opposition by authorities as well, and even one mayor said that it was a danger to the social order. See, they had just come out of the Napoleonic era of war, all kinds of unrest, a lot of damage to the Dutch economics. They got a king for the first time, so everything was going well, so to speak. And now we have this group, with sort of subversive ways that we have to deal with in this new society, this well-regulated, increasingly more prosperous society. So authorities really did not like them. So this mayor said they are a danger to the social order. They scorn and neglect good rules. They do not want smallpox vaccination, and that was true. That's probably why her own son Willem died of smallpox, because they were not vaccinated. That was against the will of God. They would not attend school because the schools were led by the Reformed Church, and the teachers were not reliable Christians for the seceded people. So Geesje, at the age of 15, left the church. She had not even done her confession of faith yet. The two towns of Genemuiden and Masterbroek called the Reverend van Raalte to be their minister. That was his first charge. He just had finished his education, and that's why we have this close bond between her and the Reverend. She does not talk very much about the persecution that followed, which was pretty extreme for probably 5 years, in which people were in jail. Van Raalte himself was in jail, and the other pastors as well. Very stiff fines that were levied to them. Several in the conventicles revivals took place, and one of them was Jan Visser. And Jan Visser, after his conversion, he had asked God to guide him to a godly girl. And he met Geesje when she was in the house of a relative, and she wanted nothing to do with him. She was then about 17, and then he asked if they could have a kind of a Bible study and prayer together in the home. So that was okay. She couldn't say no to that. And so they did for 2 years. Can you imagine that? For 2 years. And she did not relent it. And finally he said, I think it's time you make a decision, if you want to marry me or not. And she said, yes, it was time. So they married in 1841 when she was 20. Things went very well. They had a store, they bought some land, and it seemed like it was a prosperous time, but sorrow came to them. This is also an interesting account of the sort of pietist attitude. This is what she wrote on the second year of their marriage. A girl had been born to them in January of 1843. It made us very happy, but alas, she wrote, the child gained supremacy in our hearts over other things, and God took her from us, when she was 7 weeks old. We had never experienced such sorrows before, but we had to submit to God's will. But the bonds of the flesh were so strong, I thought the child was not saved. I could not rely on God's promises, which he had given to the baptized child. I prayed God to shed some light and searched the writings of many men. Then during prayer, God came to comfort me, and I could believe the child was in heaven, and I could peacefully submit to God's will. Similar sentiments arose about going to America. She was, as she wrote, so firmly attached to our home that I would rather die than go to America. And then Jan came home. He had gone to a meeting to discuss this, and Jan thought they should be going to America. So there was a lot of prayer of what to do. And then again, a psalm came to mind. And this happened very frequently with her. It was not the reading of scripture, but the psalms. They were just uppermost in her mind. If any verse 7 of this or verse 12 of that would come in the appropriate times. And this was Psalm 48, verse 6. And in paraphrase, it's, our God is our all. Time nor eternity can part us, and until death will guide us. Many people in the pietist groups, including the Seceders, had difficulty coming to the Lord's Supper because they felt unworthy. Some of you might know the Black Stocking Church or the Netherlands Reformed Church that is still with us here is in the Netherlands. And they have that same reluctance, because how do you know that you can really go to the Lord's Supper with a true and pure heart, that you've asked for forgiveness? So they don't go. So if you go to one of their churches, which we did, there might be 3 or 4 people who would dare to go, because they had had this conversion experience and were assured that they could do this in good faith. And Geesje herself wrote in 1870, "We celebrated the Lord's Supper, but because there was something that was bothering me, Satan tried to convince me that I should not partake of the sacrament." She did not say further what caused her to reject the voice of Satan, but she said God was the victor, so she did partake of that. Another excerpt from her diary. "I was very frightened about the rumors of a cholera epidemic in America. At that time, I was not ready to die and could not spare my husband or children. I felt uneasy and often cried to God in my anxiety. Then a psalm came to her mind. 'My soul, why are you so cast down? How you worry about your fate. Rest in the Lord's care.' Now I felt easier." And the next Sunday, to affirm this even more, she heard Van Raaltes have a sermon on death, where is thy sting, etc. Then I could believe that death's sting, even for me, had been taken away by Jesus. I was even willing to sacrifice my husband and children if such would redound to the honor of his name. Her sister died in childbirth. It was quite a horrible, a terrible time for Geesje as well. Even earlier than Geesje, she had been converted in the Netherlands when a very young girl. And her death was very hard on Geesje. And a song came to mind, not from a psalm this time, but from a pietist Dutch songbook about happy death. And she wrote, "Oh, how strongly I desired that my body might be freed from the burden of sin, and that I might live in complete harmony with God forever." And she says that actually quite a few times, especially when she talks about Willem, her son Willem, who died so young, and that she wished death would come sooner so that she could be with him. What is interesting about this sister, he was the mother of Ame Venema, who was the president of Hope College just before President Dimnent. He was a pastor. It's interesting actually to see the connections that the Vissers van der Haar have still in this community. Their descendants are with us today. Still, Helena Winter is one of them, and quite a few others. I think also those Visser doctors, I forget their names. I don't know how many of you know about the Clapper revival of 1865-66. This was a Methodist lay minister, preacher, whatever, lay religious person, who first began to preach on the street, then even in bars, and then he had so many followers, people were converted under his preaching, that he had asked Van Raalte and the consistory if he could meet at Pillar. First he was turned down, but the voice of the people was so strong. They wanted this revival in their church, and so he did. And every night there was a meeting, and the church was totally packed with people. Geesje prayed, she was certainly not opposed to this. Geesje prayed for two of her boys who were at the Hope Academy, who had exhibited an indifference toward religion. She writes, "Oh, my heart felt so heavy that I felt like crying outright in church in Pillar that God might have mercy on the boys and no longer permit them to continue in the way of sin." So she talked to them about their soul's condition. And then she said, "I noticed their minds were filled with anxiety. I told them about Jesus. Talked to the oldest boy to flee to Jesus with his problems, but the way remained dark for him." Here you see that word again, dark, darkness of the soul. He prayed a lot and went to the meetings every evening. So after 3 weeks of struggle and anxiety, a light finally dawned, and he began to rejoice in Jesus, his Savior. And now he began to speak and sing and pray at home and in church. So he made it, known to other people. He was 17 years old then. In 1869, they made a trip to the Netherlands, and one day there was a very bad storm, and they had to stay in their cabins. So she writes, "My faith began to waver." Here, this whole sort of pietism, about never totally sure, that there's always this temptation of Satan, to take you away from God. "And I cried to God, and he relieved me of my fears," again through a psalm that came to her mind. "But for 3 days, she and Jan did not sing," which was something they always did. Which is an interesting thing about the diaries. She sang all day long, from psalms and maybe some pietist songbooks. So she lived in, I thought, a little bit like Enoch in the Old Testament. He was walking with God, right? So she's walking with God in these psalms, just, keep coming to her mind and steadies her faith and give her joy also in time of sorrow. When they were in the Netherlands, they visited many relatives, and her mother was still living. And one evening they talked, and the mother was not sure of her salvation. And she had been reading this book by sorry, Smijtegeld. And the title, of course, is the comfort in life and dying. Very popular book among the people in the Netherlands and also the pioneers. So there are many Smijtegeld copies of this book. They were well read, as you can see here, too, that it has quite a bit of damage. This is in the Van Raalte Institute, by the way, on one of the shelves. But even by reading that book, the mother was not comforted by this. So Geesje had to leave her mother in that state, and a few months later she died. And then also in her diary, she writes that God told her, I am in command. I don't want you to sorrow about this. I am, in a sense, I do what I do, and you need to continue living your life. There are a few more things to say, but I want to give you some opportunities for questions before it's time to go to your dinner. So if you have any, or comments, or did I thoroughly depress you with this? She was in the baptismal record. She is mentioned, or the civil record. She is Geesje, G-E-E. Well, you saw it already, Geesje. But one of her daughters was named after her, the youngest one. I think it's named after her, and she's called Gezina, G-E-Z-I-N-A. So maybe some people called her that. Or they said, hey, you, to her, who knows?
Can you hear me?
Just switch it on.
Anyway, this is a comment. When I read that
It's still
hymn,
not on.
the hymn words up there, I thought the prosperity gospel is nothing new. The second line was asking for prosperity for the storekeepers. And my second question was she related to Del and Trudy van der Haar?
Yes, Del is a descendant of one of her siblings. She came with both Jan and she came with siblings. And so it's not a direct.
I thought it was interesting to know that the home for Geesje and Jan was on the Myers store corner, but the Trudy and Del van der Haar family farm in his background was on 8th and Waverly, on that little hill there. So that must have been all connected with van der Haar farmland, perhaps, or other homesteads.
That would be quite a distance, I think, between 8th and 16th.
It would be, but if you had 40
So-
acres of farm, maybe that would take up part of it. I don't know, but
I
anyway, I
have-
know Trudy has always said that was their background.
Yeah,
So, and I
could well be.
also thought how little things change. The boys are rebelling about being part of the church, and there were other things that you have said about the fact that we are not that different from the life she led. In some ways, yes,
Yeah.
but not in all.
Yes.
Any other observations or comments, questions? Then we will proceed with
Uh,
letter.
I don't think the mic is working, though. Yes. Right, yeah. The preparation to receive a kind of a conversion experience. You see that in Geesje's life with the learning of the Psalms, that was sort of a preparation for that. But Puritan piety was very crucial in the Dutch revival history. Yeah. Okay, Jean.
One of the physicians that you made reference to, Bob Fisher, currently attends Sunrise Saints with us now.
One of the Fishers does?
Yeah, Bob.
Oh. What's his name?
Harry, his brother, who was also a good brother,
Yeah.
also lived in Holland, and his widow lives in Freedom Village now.
Yes.
And so that's an interesting connection.
Yes. Yeah, there is a genealogy of the various descendants of Geesje and Jan, and many really bright, well-educated people. Her own children all went to the Hope Academy or to Hope College. Several were teachers. One was a minister. Two of them married ministers. One of them went to Africa, to the Transvaal, South Africa, served some churches in the East before they went. One married a physician.
Some of the other family line would include Helena Winter
Yes,
and Sarah Simmons, who
Yes.
are people that we know
right.
in many cases. So
Yeah,
it's interesting.
yeah.
I don't think that we have really an appreciation of the hurdles that were put in the way of pietists in terms of their certainty of conversion. And one of the authors that I read, a Scottish pietist, and not a very deep pietist, but 39 pages in his sermon on false professors of religion. That always sort of struck me, the use of professors. I had a real job getting out of that category. But anyway, 39 pages of testing yourself as to whether or not you might really be a false professor of
Yes.
religion.
Yeah,
And 39 pages of ways in which you could be deluding yourself to think that you really were religious when you really
Yes.
weren't. 39 pages of this. I mean, if you were already worried whether you were among the elect,
yes,
one of Irma's relatives in Pella, Garrett Visser, yeah, I think it was Visser, never partook of communion. Always went to church twice a Sunday, but never partook of communion
Yes.
for that very reason.
yes. Yeah, I remember a conversation I had with my stepfather about, he did not go to communion, and I said, but, I had this conversation about Jesus is there, he's welcoming you, he wants you to come, so, it's very positive. And he said, but how do I know what you say about Jesus isn't Satan speaking a spiritual language? Yeah, the uncertainty was massive. So I think I need to stop.
Well, the clock has become our enemy, but we have to think about that too.
Yeah.
So thank you very much, Nella. We appreciate
welcome.
what you've done, and I wish all of you,
Okay.
as this is our last of the season presentations for this hour, I wish you all a happy summer and a blessed summer with God's blessings guiding you. But I will make one last comment, if anybody's interested in following up on it. This is the book that Trudy Vanderhaar has put together about the family, and if any of you has access to it or would like to have access to it, you might be very interested in picking up on what Nella has talked to us about this morning. So, go in peace.
You're welcome. You're welcome.
Brian Fisher was a businessman and was a pope for many years. I wonder if he's among the descendants.
Oh,
Brian, did you
no, I didn't, no,
met him
no,
at all?
no, I don't know.